occupation. After his arrival, Baker held talks with the heir apparent and Prime Minister of Kuwait, Sheikh Saad al-Abdullah Sabah. His Royal Highness Prince Saud Al Faisal, the Foreign Minister, received at his office in Riyadh today Joe Clark, the Canadian State Minister for Foreign Affairs, currently visiting the kingdom. During the meeting, they discussed the current situation in the region after the liberation of Kuwait and the restoration of the legitimate government over there. The two ministers also reviewed the bilateral relations and ways to enhance them. The meeting was attended by Ambassador Mohammed Ma'moon Kurdi, Head of the Foreign Ministry's Economic and Cultural Department, Ambassador Nizar Madani, Chief of the Western Department of the Foreign Ministry, and the Canadian Ambassador to the Kingdom, Alan Liver. Egyptian Deputy Premier and Foreign Minister Dr. Asmat Abdel Majid arrived in Riyadh this evening. He was welcomed at the airport by His Royal Highness Prince Saud Al Faisal, the Foreign Minister, Chief of Protocol at the Foreign Ministry, Ambassador Abdurrahman Al-Wasir, Egyptian Ambassador to the Kingdom, Sayyid Qasim Al-Masri, and Commander of the Egyptian troops participating in the joint forces. The Foreign Minister of Italy, Gianni De Michelis, arrived in Riyadh this evening. He was received at the airport by His Royal Highness Prince Saud Al Faisal, the Foreign Minister, Chief of Protocols, Ambassador Abdurrahman Al-Wasir, Commander of the Italian troops participating in the joint forces, Lieutenant General Marina Radiono, and the Italian Ambassador to the Kingdom, Mr. Mario Leni. The Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources and Acting Planning Minister Hisham Nader met in his office this afternoon in Riyadh the Canadian State Minister for Foreign Affairs, Joe Clark. During the meeting, they discussed bilateral relations and cooperation, particularly in the oil field. The meeting was attended by the delegation accompanying the Canadian Minister, the Canadian Ambassador to the Kingdom, and a number of officials in the ministry. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Indonesia signed in the Kingdom today the final document of the joint agreement on mutual exemption of taxes and customs charges on the activities of air cargo establishments in the two countries. The agreement was signed on behalf of the Kingdom by Mohammed Abul Khair, the Minister of Finance and National Economy, and on behalf of the Indonesian government by the Indonesian Ambassador to the Kingdom, Mr. Sokasa Somawijaya.
And now the international news. Syrian Vice President Abdel Halim Khaddam said yesterday that Iraqi President Saddam Hussein had caused massive losses to Iraq because he put his own ambitions before those of his people. Speaking of the arrogance and greed which he said had blinded the man who could have saved Iraq, Khaddam said that Saddam was now a gentle lamb, pleading peace and giving concessions, not the giant he had previously declared himself to be. In an apparent reference to Saddam's use of Republican Guard units to quell popular unrest in several Iraqi cities, Khaddam said that Iraqis were being killed twice, once by being thrown into this war, then by slaughter for rejecting the result. Khaddam held the pact signed last Wednesday by Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates on cooperation and coordination of security measures in the region. He said countries that set up a new Arab order would build Arab strength and pave the way for joint action. A Jordanian official said that 40 foreign journalists and the US prisoners of war drove to freedom in Jordan today after being released by Iraq. He said the prisoners of war traveling in a separate convoy were handed over to American embassy officials at the Jordanian-Iraqi border before flying to Bahrain via Amman. The journalists representing news organizations in Britain, France, Italy, Norway, and the United States were held by Iraq for 5 days. They also drove back for 8 hours across the desert to Jordan's Riyadh border post, 280 kilometers east of Amman. Iraq handed over the journalists and US soldiers to the Red Cross in Baghdad last night, and they spent the night in the Iraqi capital. The journalists were seen on television last night and appeared well. The 40 journalists disappeared after setting out from Kuwait last Sunday for the southern Iraqi city of Basra, torn by protests against the government of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, the longest-serving Western correspondent in Baghdad during the Gulf War, Peter Arnett of cable news network CNN, arrived in the Jordanian capital Amman last night. Arnett, who was among dozens of Western journalists and technicians expelled from Iraq at short notice, described the difficulties of living in and reporting from Iraq at the height of the bombing of Baghdad.
There's no electricity, there's no running water. The city has been, the country seems to be put back 30 or 40 years. Of course he's got major problems. Political, social, international. The political situation today, there's many roadblocks. As we came out, we were checked 8 or 10 times as we left Baghdad on roads that normally had no checkpoints. There were elite troops, special troops checking our credentials very carefully. There's a security crackdown.
Addressing an invited audience of conservative academics and businessmen in Washington yesterday, former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher warned of dark forces trying to hold back Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's reform program. The former Prime Minister praised United States President George Bush and his administration for their leadership during the Gulf War crisis.
Soviet Union, there's accumulating evidence that progress towards reform has been slowed, possibly halted. Dark forces of reaction are on the rise. At such a time, it is vital that all those committed to reform should not falter. No doubt some reformers never expected reform to extend to multi-party democracy and a free economy. But no man can fix the boundaries of the march of a nation. It's not just a military alliance, but an alliance in defense of a way of life. NATO must not be discarded. It is in the interests of Europe that the United States should continue to play that dominant role in NATO to which we have become accustomed. Indeed, as was demonstrated in the Gulf, for all the assistance which Britain and the other powers gave, only one nation really has the power to defend freedom and security in the world today. That is and will for the foreseeable future remain to be the United States.
An estimated 15,000 Albanians crowding the Italian port city of Brindisi are facing increasingly difficult sanitary and food conditions. By this morning, Italian officials managed to move some 7,000 Albanians to emergency.
A Delta rocket took off from Cape Canaveral, Florida, yesterday carrying an $80 million communications satellite similar to one used during the Gulf War, to relay reports from journalists. It was the second such spacecraft to be put into orbit by the International Maritime Satellite Organization known as Inmarsat. The first went up in October last year. Most of the approximately 13,000 computer terminals in use by Inmarsat customers are on seagoing vessels. They allow users to call telex or fax something anywhere in the world. So far, about 20 units have been installed on planes. About 1,000 of the terminals are land transportable and used in areas where there are few or no working telephones. After a few weeks of tests, the new Inmarsat 2 satellite will be maneuvered into space, 35,680 kilometers above the Atlantic Ocean. It should be operational in 6 weeks' time. Astronomers at Australia's Parkes Observatory in New South Wales have monitored an unexplained signal from space. The group led by Dr. David Blair has been working on Operation Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They devised a radio beacon to transmit a signal containing the symbol of a hydrogen atom and the mathematical symbol Pi. Hydrogen is the most common element of our galaxy, and Pi is a universal symbol in physics, engineering, and architecture. Blair said the return signal could not yet be explained, but he said there was always a chance of some communication, as Earth was just a pinprick in a galaxy of some million possible civilizations. Parkes' team intends to put out further signals this year and hopes for another response.
And the number pi, 22/7, the number that tells you the difference between the radius and the circumference of a circle, was the number that was discovered by the ancient Greeks. It's a number that's critical for all electrical engineering and architecture, all sorts of things. Almost everything our civilization does depends on this number pi.
Australia's eastern states went once again suffering the effects of raging bushfires on Thursday. Temperatures reached the high 30s. Many fires broke out in western Sydney and in eastern Melbourne. Many homes in the bushland of these areas were burnt out and destroyed, despite the efforts of fire crews who fought to control the widespread fires. Well, with this disastrous item, we come to the end of our 10 o'clock news, brought to you from Channel 2 of Saudi Arabian Television. We thank you for being with us and have a good night.